Cations are positive ions, and anions are negative ions. Sodium is the most important cation because it makes up 90 to 95% of all solids in your extracellular fluid. The main anion in the extracellular fluid is chloride. The main cation in the intracellular fluid is potassium. The osmolality of your body fluids is the amount of solids in your fluids. Your body fluids have an osmolality of about 300 milliosmoles per liter. There are variations, however. Recall that in the kidneys, the interstitial fluid surrounding the collecting ducts has an osmotic gradient. Let's begin with sodium. Why is the extracellular sodium level so important? Sodium is linked to plasma volume. Remember, as long as the membrane is permeable to water, if you increase sodium reabsorption, water will follow. Plasma is primarily water. By increasing the water in the plasma, plasma volume goes up, and plasma volume is related to blood pressure. Let's look at the illustration that I've drawn here on the screen. The green balls represent sodium ions. On side A, notice that in the interstitial fluid, I have fewer sodium ions than in the plasma. That means that the interstitial fluid is hypotonic to the plasma, which is hypertonic. We can use those terms when describing osmosis. Remember, osmosis is the movement of water across a semi-permeable membrane along water's concentration gradient. A hypotonic solution has fewer solids than a hypertonic solution, and we use those terms to compare two different solutions on either side of a membrane. Water will always move from a hypotonic solution into a hypertonic solution across the membrane until equilibrium is reached. On side B, the opposite situation exists. The interstitial fluid is hypertonic to the plasma. That makes the plasma hypotonic to the interstitial fluid, so water will move from the plasma into the interstitial fluid until equilibrium is reached. A second reason that sodium is important is that it provides energy for the movement of substances across the membrane. Let's look at the figure in the lower right-hand corner of this slide. The purple structures are transport proteins. The one on the far left is a sodium-potassium pump. Sodium-potassium pumps pump 3 sodiums out of the cell from the intracellular fluid into the extracellular fluid and 2 potassiums in the opposite direction. When sodium is pumped into the extracellular fluid, it helps increase the concentration of the sodium on the outside of the cell. This develops a concentration gradient that can be used to transport other molecules. Let's look at the 2 darker purple transport proteins. We'll start with the one in the middle. Sodium moves along its concentration gradient, being carried by this transport protein. This provides the energy that is required to move another substance, in this case glucose. Both substances may move in the same direction, or they could move in opposite directions. In either case, the sodium is providing the energy to actively transport the second substance. A third reason why the extracellular concentration of sodium is important is that it helps establish the resting membrane potential. Recall that in a resting membrane potential, there is more sodium on the outside of the cell in the extracellular fluid and more potassium on the inside or intracellular fluid. There is also a separation of charges, and that's due to the distribution of these ions. A resting membrane potential, therefore, is described as being polar, and this is critical for action potentials. Let's review. Hyponatremia, or low sodium levels, and/or hyperkalemia, high potassium, will stimulate the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. In response to aldosterone, the principal cells in the distal convoluted tubule and collecting ducts will reabsorb sodium and secrete potassium in order to return ion levels to normal. Now let's look at what happens in hypotension. Recall that a drop in blood pressure in the afferent arterioles causes the JG cells to release renin. Renin stimulates the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system or mechanism. Angiotensin II is a vasoconstrictor. It stimulates also the thirst center and causes the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. All of these actions will increase blood pressure. Let's look at some imbalances. Hypernatremia, or elevated sodium levels in the extracellular fluid, will bring about several outcomes. Let's look at the illustration that I have on the right. This is a cell surrounded by interstitial fluid. Notice that the sodium in the interstitial fluid is higher than the sodium inside the cell. This influences the amount of water. So now we can see that there's more water inside the cell than outside the cell due to the hypernatremia. Since water moves by osmosis along water's gradient, water will leave the cell and move into the interstitial fluid. When this occurs, the interstitial fluid then is diluted and the osmolarity of the interstitial fluid drops. It now becomes lower than the osmolarity of the plasma. Water, therefore, will move into the plasma. This will lead to hypertension, as well as cell shrinking. Hyponatremia will do just the opposite. Hyponatremia leads to cellular swelling, as well as an accumulation of water in the interstitial fluid. Pulmonary edema is this accumulation in the interstitial fluid within the lungs. Pulmonary edema will interfere with gas exchange, decreasing the amount of oxygen in your arteries. Cerebral edema will influence the function of the neurons. Both of these situations can be fatal.